The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the distinguished gentleman from Maryland for yielding me the customary 30 minutes, and I would yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The rule before us today provides for consideration of three pieces of legislation. The first bill, H.R. 1333, limits the president's existing authority to restrict entry of foreigners into the United States. Border Patrol is encountering more than 5,500 individuals per day at our southern border. Let me say that again. They're encountering 5,500 individuals per day at the southern border. Over the weekend, President Biden finally acknowledged the situation for what it is, not a challenge, but a crisis. Yet House Democrats are moving forward with a bill that does nothing to stop the surge of migrants at the southern border and instead actually weakens our national security. Along the same lines, House Resolution 330 provides for consideration of H.R. 1573, which requires access to counsel for all travelers referred to a secondary inspection at airports and other ports of entry. Again, this bill does nothing to address the Biden border crisis. It would actually complicate the job of Border Patrol agents while costing taxpayers $825 million over the next 5 years. With a 233% increase in fentanyl seizures at our southern border, it's a shame that my liberal colleagues across the aisle are actually creating more work for Border Patrol. Instead, we should provide these brave men and women with much-needed resources to address the national security and public health consequences of the Biden border crisis. Lastly, this resolution makes an order H.R. 51. Legislation admitting the present District of Columbia as the 51st state and authorizing special elections for 2 senators and 1 representative. This is nothing more than an unconstitutional power grab by Democrats to gain 2 ultra-progressive D.C. Senate seats and force radical, far-left policies on the American people. Our founding fathers never intended for D.C. to become a state. In Federalist number 43, James Madison argued that if the capital city were situated within a state, the federal government would be subject to undue influence by the host state. As such, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the U.S. Constitution establishes a neutral district for our nation's representatives to meet and vote on equal ground. Further, the 23rd Amendment grants 3 presidential electors specifically for the district. The original meaning of the district in the Constitution and the necessary repeal of the 23rd Amendment requires an amendment to the Constitution in order for D.C. to even become a state. Just don't take my word for it, though. Since 1963, every Justice Department, Republican and Democrat, that has addressed the issue of D.C. statehood has concluded that Congress does not have the authority to alter the status of the city legislatively. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy thought it was inconceivable that D.C. would be granted statehood without repealing the 23rd Amendment, and the result would, quote, produce an absurdity, end quote. Again, those are the words of RFK. Finally, the legislation before us today does nothing to address the financial implications of D.C. statehood. According to a 2020 study, D.C. ranked 150th out of 150 of the largest cities for its lack of operating efficiency. 150 out of 150. The federal government provides billions of dollars to D.C. each year for everything from the judicial system to the pension system. Yet House Democrats are so desperate to jam this measure through that under H.R. 51, the federal government will remain responsible for funding many of the new state's functions. There's absolutely no incentive for the new state to work towards financial self-sufficiency, meaning Americans in other states would be forced to fund D.C. Democrats' priorities. Again, House Democrats are pushing ahead to admit a new state to the Union purely for partisan gain while ignoring the constitutional, practical, and legal challenges in doing so. That is why I urge my colleagues to oppose this rule. And with that, Madam Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
My colleague may have said that these are merely my assertions. They're certainly my arguments, but they're also supported by others, particularly well-known members of the Liberal Party. The former mayor of D.C. himself, Mayor Walter Washington, said, and I quote, "I would have problems with statehood in terms of exacting from it some enclaves or little enclaves all around the city. Ultimately, it seems to me that that would erode the very fabric of the city itself and the viability of the city," end quote. Again, that was the former mayor of Washington, D.C., who was talking about the enclaves that are being called for in this bill. Additionally, the former D.C. delegate, Walter Fauntroy, himself said that a bill like this would be in direct defiance of the prescription of the Founding Fathers. And as far as the constitutional argument, it's just not me making the assertion that this would be unconstitutional, because there's an issue, and that's the 23rd Amendment. But don't take it from me. Look at the Carter administration DOJ. They said that to provide statehood for the district by constitutional amendment would have to be by constitutional amendment. Otherwise, it would ignore the framers' intent. John Harmon, Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel during the Carter administration, said that this could not be accomplished, in our view, this would have to be accomplished through constitutional amendment. Further, RFK, Robert Kennedy, said that Congress likely did not have the authority under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 to shrink the federal district to essentially the same size that's being discussed. The argument, and I'm quoting, "The argument that the federal district constituting the seat of government is a permanent part of our constitutional system is substantially strengthened by the adoption of the 23rd Amendment." Thinking that we can merely repeal an amendment through legislative action, that's not how the Constitution works. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had the 21st Amendment, which was needed to repeal the 18th Amendment. We could have just merely repealed it. Additionally, there's talks about this not being a political exercise. My colleague has been quoted, actually in the Washington Post, saying that there's a national political logic for it being DC statehood. Because the Senate has become the principal obstacle to social progress on a whole range of issues. Not my words, my colleagues' words. This issue is all about a power grab.